I just want to begin by saying thank you for having me. This is my first time in Norway. I did not know what to expect. I have to say, all of you whom I've had the chance to speak to are extremely kind and polite and interesting, and you don't remind me at all of Vikings, which is what I was a little bit worried about. Because I'd actually just seen the Viking exhibit at the British Museum last week in London, and I was a little nervous. And everything else I know about Norway comes from watching Lillehammer. So do you see is the show on here? Yeah? So, I live in New York, so I'm sensitive to how the place where we live is portrayed on TV. And so the first 5 or 6 people that I met here, I said, everything I know about here, I learned from watching Lillehammer. And I'm sure it's not at all realistic. It'd be like you watching Law and Order, some show in New York, and thinking that everybody's getting killed all the time. And I wouldn't want you to think that about New York. So everybody I said that to said, no, that's pretty much the way it is here. So I don't really know what to expect. I will warn you, I have no pictures, just me. That's all. I could practice by golf swing. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I have a very fond place in my heart for Norwegians generally, although in our home we don't call you Norwegians. My son, I have 2 kids, my son is now 13, and he began to read kind of young, one of those kids who starts to read on his own, and he just really liked reading. He loved Roald Dahl, but he read a lot of stuff. And like a lot of kids who learn to read on their own, they say words in their mind and then sometimes say them aloud, but they don't come out the way that we all know them as. So he once came up to me and said, "Dad, can you tell me anything about the Norwegians?" So when I look at all of you, nice, kind, non-Viking people, but you are Norwegians to me forever, not Norwegians. So what do I know about Norwegians? If you are at all like the rest of our species, which I suspect you are, I know that you're pretty honest, which is great. Modern society and modern business especially rewards honesty, which is a wonderful feature of capitalism and capital democracy and things like that. We really seek out and punish people who are dishonest, which is good. But let me run a little experiment here. Let me see by show of hands. Raise your hand if, when you use a public toilet, a public restroom, afterwards, if you do not wash your hands afterwards, okay? So let me see. Hoist them high. Let's see what we have here. All right. Okay. So I already said I think you're pretty honest. And you look to be pretty hygienic, pretty clean from what I can tell. But I know that a bunch of you, particularly the men, are lying to me now, okay? And I know you're lying because we actually have data on this very question, which is how many people say they wash their hands when they should, and how many people actually do. And these data are a little bit hard to get because you can't put cameras in a bathroom, for instance. But there are ways to get this data. So I gather some of this data myself. I travel a lot, as I'm guessing many of you do as well. I fly a lot. And often when I'll get off an airplane, and if I need to use the restroom, I will do so, and then wash my hands. And then at the sink, I'll just kind of linger for a while. I'll hang out, and I carry a notebook always, and I'll just mark down the number of men. I haven't tried it in the ladies' room yet, but the number of men who use a toilet and then wash their hands and those who don't. And it turns out that about 70% of the men who get off an airplane in just about any airport in the world I've been to will wash, and 30% don't. Okay? Now, that's why I know that probably 3 out of the 10 men here are lying to me, which is fine. But the point is this, is not to call you liars, because we all kind of lie or deceive ourselves to some degree. The point is this, if we brought the 30% of the non-washers here and sat them with their friends and colleagues and maybe bosses, they're not going to raise their hands either. The point is that the way that you gather data, the question you ask, or more broadly, the circumstances under which you gather data, will tell you a great deal about how reliable those data are. So we know this intellectually. We know that people will say one thing and do another. It's not again, that we're being dishonest or that we lie. Sometimes we just have a bad recollection of the way we do things. But the point is this. If you want to solve a problem, and really what I want to talk to you today about is problem solving. If you want to solve a problem, you need to work incredibly hard to get data that reflects the real world, that reflects what economists call revealed behavior, as opposed to what we say we do, which is declared preference. So you've got declared preference, which is how I say I will vote or spend my money or do some kind of project or when I'll finish a project, and then revealed preference, which is what you actually do. So the first rule of thumb of thinking like a freak is when you want to solve a problem, get real data, work really hard. This can be much harder than you think. A lot of us work and live in organizations where there's a lot of data being produced that is not very reliable. So just as I argued that a bunch of you are not very reliable in telling me about your hand hygiene, I would argue that you need to seek out data that's going to give you a real way to solve a problem, however you can get that data. Now, the other, Think Like a Freak, this is our third book. And in the first two, we just kind of told ridiculous stories about whatever we could get a lot of data on. So we looked at the difference in danger if you have a kid between a swimming pool and a gun. Turns out that in the US, but almost everywhere around the world, many, many more children die from backyard swimming pool accidents than from guns. Even though there are probably about 300 million guns in the US and many, many, many fewer swimming pools. So it's nice to get data to look at problems to see what we are afraid of and maybe what we shouldn't be so afraid of. Another key piece of thinking like a freak, if one chooses to do so, is we argue that we should all think like a child a bit more often. So let me explain. So kids, we like to think of children as kind of incomplete, inchoate, imperfect versions of ourselves. And you can kind of understand why that is, because there are a lot of things that we learn to do as adults that require a lot of attention that children don't have. So you don't really want children driving a car down the road because they'll be looking around at stuff or their feet can't reach the pedals. You don't want children, let's say, reading an important contract or running a nuclear reactor. Those are things that we don't really like children doing. So why are children bad at that kind of thing? One big reason is that children don't really pay attention the way adults do, okay? But if you think about what paying attention is, what we mean when we say pay attention, it really means pay attention to one thing, meaning driving or running a nuclear reactor or reading a contract. And what kids do is very, very different. So in service of encouraging all of us to think a little bit more like a kid, let me give you an example. Can you hold my notebook for 1 second? Thank you. You can look through it. There's nothing very valuable in there. So here's one thing I've learned recently about where kids are much better than us. Is anyone here a magician by any chance? No? All right. So I'm not either, but I know a bunch of magicians. And so one thing we found is that if you ask magicians whether they had a gun to their head and they had to fool an audience, meaning have their tricks really work on an audience, would they rather they perform before an audience of adults or children? And I, probably like most of you, would think, well, definitely the kids, because kids are kind of dumb and we can fool them. And adults, they're smarter and they're more experienced and so on. So as it turns out, every magician will tell you exactly the opposite. They say that if you want to fool an audience, then kids are much, much harder. So I said, why? So here's an example. So pretend that I'm a magician, again, which I'm not. I don't know the first thing about magic. But pretend I want to do this standard thing that magicians do with a handkerchief, and we've all seen this, right? And I'll say to you, okay, so here I've got a handkerchief, nice black kind of polka dots on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this handkerchief and I'm going to move it up here for a little bit. And that's all I've done. That's all I've done, right? And now, what have you guys done? You guys have looked at the handkerchief. Why? Because you're very good at paying attention. And by paying attention, that means that I can manipulate you beautifully because I can steer you by cues into looking exactly what I want you to look at. So some kids will do that. Some kids will look at it. But then in the crowd, there's always a couple kids who will say, while I'm doing this, they'll say, oh, why is he putting his hand in his pocket and putting a plastic thumb on his real thumb? So that when I do this trick, the kids have figured it out. So astonishingly, kids are much better at what magicians call blowing up a secret than adults, because when they pay attention, they're actually kind of looking around at a whole bunch of different things. And they are not so compliant that they will follow and do exactly as I suggest that you do. And because you are good, trained adults, you are very happy to do exactly what I ask you to do. So that's great if, again, you're running a nuclear power plant and you need to pay attention. But if you're trying to come up with ideas or ask questions or solve problems, then being a kid and having attention that can go all over the place can actually be incredibly good. All right, I'll take the notebook back. Thank you. So here's some of the things that children do that we kind of stop doing when we get older. Children will sit around and think about stuff that they care about and nothing else. We don't really have that luxury, but we also stop doing that. Children will come up with ideas and schemes and solutions and questions that most of us would be too embarrassed to ever float in public, at least, right? So we've all been in that meeting where, let's say there's some desperate situation at work. You have a big problem, and the boss says, all right, brainstorming session at 4 p.m., and everybody on deck, and then you get in the meeting, and the boss says, okay, there is no idea too stupid for this meeting. I just want to hear everything, right? So you've all heard that, and then you've had this idea that you've been sitting on for like a year, but you've been scared to say it. So you figure this is the time. You just said there's no idea that's too stupid. So you raise your hand and you offer this idea, and then the boss says, oh, I guess I was wrong. There are ideas that are too stupid, and that was one of them. And so what do? You will never again volunteer to ask that kind of childlike question. And that's what happens is we all kind of get that conditioned and beaten out of us so that by the time we're here, where we are now, we're conditioned that when we're asked to come up with a solution or a question, we're very good at coming up with something that we know won't get us laughed out of the room. That's why so many of the people that actually invent stuff, like you and everybody who's been talking about inventing and innovation, that's why innovation and invention does not happen so often in large groups. That's why so many of the things that we really cherish, democracy is maybe a notable example. That was a bunch of people, but a lot of it happens in really small groups, because to have the courage to fail and to have the courage to come up with those 20 ideas, most of which are terrible, but one of which might be great, it's very hard to do that if you're scared of being judged as the adult who wants to look responsible, who doesn't want to look childlike, and so on. And so I would argue that thinking like a child whenever possible is really valuable. I would also argue that, and this is going to sound very self-interested, that telling stories is a really great way to get your message across, especially if you're trying to persuade people. Okay, if you're trying to persuade, let's say you're trying to persuade someone who doesn't want to be persuaded about whatever it is, an ideological issue or a product or something. So how do you do that? So the first and scariest idea is that you should probably just quit and give up. Because people who don't want to be persuaded, people get very, very locked into their ideas and their biases and so on. And what we've learned from research over the last 3 or 4 years is really frightening, which is that the smarter you are, the more likely you are to hold an extreme view on a topic, whether that topic is climate change or gun control, whatever. So this is puzzling, because mostly we think that educated people educate themselves a lot and find out a lot about an issue and then get to a moderate position. That's kind of the promise of education. But as it turns out, that's not the way it works. What happens is that the smarter you are, the more you read and listen and watch, but smarter people are really good at seeking out stories and evidence that confirms what they already believe to be true. So you end up with a bunch of really smart people on either ends of the spectrum. So if you're trying to persuade someone, that can be really hard because they have a view, they're very confident, they're dug in, and they don't really want to hear your story. So how can you tell a story that works? How can you tell a story that will actually persuade someone? So I would offer a few ideas. One is don't pretend your argument is perfect. It is astonishing to me how, especially in the political realm, but also especially in the environmental realm, solutions are presented as all benefit and no cost. And if you know even a little bit of economics, there's just no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a perfect solution. So acknowledge that your solution, while it has maybe a lot of benefits for a lot of people, there are going to be some people who lose out. I was talking last night with Shannon from Google about the driverless car. Do you guys follow the driverless car that's happening a little bit? So Google and every major car company in the world are working on these cars that will be totally autonomously driven, that we'll just get in and they will bring us to where we want to go. And the technology is pretty close to there. I've ridden in one at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And so if you want to make the argument that the driverless car will, let's say, save 1 million lives a year, which is very possible, there are 1.2 million traffic deaths a year worldwide right now, about 95% of which are due to human error. So as much as we think we're good at stuff, humans, we're not as good as we think. And we're not very good at driving. And computers actually will probably be a lot better. So it's quite possible that within 20 or 30 years, there will be 1 million people a year fewer dying from getting hit by cars, which is great news, right? So if that's the argument I want to make, I can pump it up, and I can tell you all the great things about it. But you, if you're dead set against the idea, you will probably be more likely to buy into my argument if I tell you that I've also thought about the downsides. If I've also thought about the fact that, in the US alone, there are 3.5 million people who earn their living by driving, including Disney buses, although you have a lot of automated trams there. So what about those 3.5 million people? What are they supposed to do? So that's a problem we'll have to solve. It's a separate problem from people getting run over, but it's a problem. What else might happen if cars are driverless? It means that drunk driving will not be a big problem anymore, which is great. For everybody who likes to go out and have fun and drink, but they have to drive. We know that drunk driving is really dangerous. And drunk walking, it's true. You are 7 times more likely to die walking a mile drunk than driving a mile drunk. So friends don't let friends walk drunk or drive drunk. But as it turns out, if we could all go out and have dinner and parties and drink and not have to worry about driving, that sounds great. But if I want to make an honest argument, I might also say that, well, maybe that would turn us into a world of heavy, heavy, heavy drinkers. Maybe one of the things that's keeping us from drinking too much is the fact that we have to drive. I don't know. The fact is, predicting the future is really hard. A lot of people pretend to be able to do it. They're terrible. We once did a kind of meta-study of stock pickers, political analysts, sports experts, and the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, which tries to predict corn and wheat yields and so on. And we looked at all of those experts and measured their predictive ability against, let's say, the market. And it turns out that the best and most highly paid experts in all these fields are about as good as a monkey with a dartboard, okay? Which is to say, about chance, about even chance. So predicting the future is very hard, and pretending that your solution to a problem will be perfect is kind of not a very good idea. So how do stories help? Why do stories help? I would argue that stories help for a number of reasons. They resonate with us. We identify with them. They are memorable. Stories can turn rules and theory into something that we actually process and remember. So let me give an example of this. What is, we would agree, the most famous, the most widely read book in the history of the world? What would we argue would be that book? The Bible, right? The Bible is pretty, by a factor of maybe 10 or 20, more read than anything else. Okay, so I don't know, do people read the Bible in Norway as part of the growing up? It's familiar with it to some degree? Can I just see show of hands, the Bible somewhat? Okay. What would we say is the most famous set of rules in the Bible? 10 Commandments, right? All right, so let me see somebody who has read some Bible and who has some, okay, so you, all right. So do you, how do you feel about being embarrassed publicly? You okay with that? You all right? Okay. What is your name? Sorry? Ellen? Oh, that's my wife's name. Hi. How do you spell it? Oh, yeah. You're not American or British or something, are you? You're Norwegian? What's that? German. Yeah. Hi. Okay. So Ellen, German Ellen, who's read some Bible. So very little. Do you want to? You're saying very little because you don't like to be embarrassed publicly. So maybe there's someone who likes to be embarrassed. What about the gentleman sitting next to you? You were raising your hand as well? Yeah, you're better about being embarrassed than her? Oh, you've read the Bible. Are you German as well? Yeah. What is your name? Olaf. All right, let's go. You know what? We'll make it easy. I'll ask it of both of you so you can collaborate in your embarrassment, okay? Yeah. Okay, we'll pick on the Germans. So, because you picked on us. Come on, let's be honest, all right? All right. So the most read book in history, the most famous set of rules in the most famous book. So theoretically, we know them front and back, backwards and forwards, all 10 of them, like we could recite the letters of the alphabet. So Olaf and Ellen, let's hear the 10. No, that's actually not. That should be one. Don't lie. I don't think. Well, bear false witness against your neighbor. Yeah, okay, lie. Envy, covet the neighbor's wife or husband, it should have been, yeah. Did you say abortion? Oh, worship, yeah. No false gods, yeah. All right, that's good. Honor parents, good. That no one gets that, yeah. That's good. 4. Sorry? Stealing, yeah. Don't steal. There's a big one. Don't kill, yeah. Good. That's like, yeah. All right, any more? I mean, that's pretty good. That's better than average. Ellen, honestly, that's pretty good. So let me think, what else? Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Honor mother and father. Keep the Sabbath day holy. There are a few. But the point is this: that was actually not bad. 6 out of 10. It took a little bit. But the fact is that these are the most famous rules in the most read book in history, and even people who go to church a lot and who've read the Bible a lot don't know them. So as it turns out, there was a survey done in the U.S., and I distrust surveys like with your hand washing, but there was a survey done that said only 70% of Americans could name even one